She left a jar of honey on his porch every Sunday. He left the door open every Monday. The first jar appeared on a Sunday morning in March, set on the top step of the porch of the house at the end of Riddle Road, 3 miles outside of Jessamine, Kentucky, in the spring of 1887. The jar was a pint mason jar with a cloth lid tied with twine, and the honey inside was dark amber, the kind of honey that comes from wildflower and clover, and the particular combination of blossoms that grows in the hills east of town, where the bees work from April to October and produce honey that is sweeter and more complex than the pale commercial honey sold in stores. There was no note attached to the twine. There was no name written on the cloth. There was only the jar, sitting on the step in the early light, and the man who found it when he stepped outside to check the weather did not know who had left it or why. The man was Garrett Hollis. He was 38 years old, a widower of 2 years, a tobacco farmer whose farm had been productive when his wife was alive, and that had become less productive since her death, not because the soil had changed or the seasons had shifted, but because Garrett had changed. And the change was the kind that affects everything a man touches, without the man understanding that he is the source of the decline. His wife, Ada, had died of a fever that took her in 3 days, a fever that arrived on a Tuesday and that took her voice on Wednesday and her consciousness on Thursday and her life on Friday. And the speed of it was part of what had broken him, because there had been no time to prepare or to say the things that needed saying, or to hold her hand long enough for the holding to feel like enough. He did not neglect the farm after that. He worked it every day, dawn to dark, with the mechanical persistence of a man who has nothing else to do, and who uses work the way some men use whiskey, not for pleasure, but for the obliteration of thought. He ate poorly, meals that were fuel and nothing more. He slept poorly, waking in the small hours to a house that was too quiet and a bed that was too wide. He spoke to almost no one, because speaking required a kind of energy that grief had taken from him, and that he did not know how to get back. He ate the honey. He spread it on the cornbread he made every other day, cornbread that was adequate but not good, because Garrett cooked the way a man cooks when cooking is a chore rather than an act of care, with the minimum effort required to produce something edible. The honey improved the cornbread. The honey improved everything it touched, which is what good honey does, and which is also what kindness does when it arrives without conditions or expectations. And Garrett ate it, and did not think much about where it had come from, because thinking about things required the energy he did not have. The second jar appeared the following Sunday. Same porch step, same mason jar, same dark amber honey, same absence of note or name. Garrett ate it. The third jar appeared the Sunday after that. Garrett ate it. By the fourth Sunday he had begun to expect it, and the expecting was the first thing he had expected in 2 years, that was not work or sleep or the dull continuation of days that were identical to each other in their emptiness. He did not analyze the expecting. He simply noticed it, the way a man notices the first warm day after a long winter, not with celebration, but with the quiet recognition that something has shifted. The woman who left the honey was Opal Sayers. She was 31, unmarried and content in the unmarrying, the daughter of a beekeeper who had died 3 years ago and left her 30 hives and a small house on 10 acres in the hills east of Jessamine, and the knowledge of bees and honey that her father had spent 20 years teaching her. She kept the hives the way her father had kept them, with respect for the bees, and an understanding that the beekeeper does not own the bees, but is in partnership with them, a partnership that requires patience and gentleness, and the willingness to be stung occasionally, without holding a grudge. She harvested the honey in late summer and early fall, extracting the frames and spinning them in the centrifuge her father had built, and filtering the honey through cheesecloth, and pouring it into the mason jars she collected and cleaned and stored in the cellar. She sold it at the market in town on Saturdays, and she made enough to live on, which was not much, but which was sufficient for a woman who did not require much, and who had learned from bees that sufficiency is its own kind of wealth. She had known Garrett's wife, Ada, not well. They had been acquaintances, the kind of women who spoke at church and at the market, and who knew each other's names and circumstances without knowing each other's hearts. But Opal had watched Garrett after Ada died, the way people in small communities watch each other, not intrusively, but with the peripheral awareness that comes from living in proximity. And she had seen the decline. The weight loss, the silence, the way he stopped coming to town except when he absolutely had to, the way his clothes hung on him like clothes hung on a frame, rather than worn by a body, the way his eyes, which had been sharp and present when Ada was alive, had become the eyes of a man who was looking at everything and seeing nothing. She had watched him at church in the months after Ada's funeral, sitting in the same pew he had always sat in, alone now, his hands folded, and his head bowed, and his lips moving with the hymns, but his voice absent, as though the words were traveling from his mouth to nowhere. She left the honey because she did not know what else to do. She did not know Garrett well enough to knock on his door and offer help, because help offered by a stranger is often received as intrusion, and Opal was not intrusive by nature. She was a woman who understood bees, and bees are creatures that do their work without announcement, that provide without demanding acknowledgement, that sustain without requiring gratitude. And Opal had learned from her father, who had learned from his father, that the best things you can do for another creature are the things you do without making the creature feel indebted. She had absorbed this philosophy the way a beekeeper absorbs the habits of her hives, gradually and completely, and without realizing that the absorption has occurred until the philosophy is indistinguishable from the person. By the 6th Sunday, Garrett was waiting. He did not wait on the porch. That would have been too deliberate, too much like caring, and caring was the thing he had stopped doing. But he woke earlier than usual and listened for the sound of footsteps on the road, and when he heard them, light and quick, and when he heard the soft click of the jar being placed on the wood, he went to the window and looked out, and saw the back of a woman walking down the road in the direction of the hills. A woman in a brown dress, with dark hair pinned up, and a basket over her arm, and he did not recognize her, but he watched her until she was out of sight, and the watching was the first time in 2 years that he had looked at something that was not the farm, or the inside of the house, or the ceiling above his bed. He left the door open the following Monday. He did not leave it open as a message, or an invitation, or a signal, or perhaps he did, and could not admit it to himself, because admitting it would have required acknowledging that the honey had changed something, and that the change was welcome, and that welcoming change was a betrayal of the grief that had become his only companion. He left the door open because the spring air was warm, and the house was stale, and the door had been closed for 2 years, and the closing had not helped. Opal saw the open door. She saw it the following Sunday when she came with the 7th jar, and she understood the open door the way she understood bees, not through analysis, but through the instinct that comes from paying close attention to living things over a long period of time. The open door was not an invitation. It was a crack. It was the first crack in the wall that grief had built, and cracks are how light gets in, and light is what honey needs to be made. And Opal knew about light and honey better than she knew about almost anything. She left the jar, and she left a note. The note said, "The honey is from the clover field above Miller Creek. I keep 30 hives there. My name is Opal Sayers." The note was factual. It was not sentimental or forward or presumptuous. It was the kind of note a beekeeper would write, direct, functional, containing only the information necessary and nothing more. Garrett read the note. He read it standing on the porch in the morning light, with the jar in one hand, and the note in the other, and the open door behind him, and he felt something he had not felt in 2 years, which was curiosity. He was curious about Opal Sayers. He was curious about the 30 hives and the clover field above Miller Creek. He was curious about a woman who would leave honey on a stranger's porch every Sunday for 7 weeks, without asking for anything in return. He went to the market the following Saturday. He had not been to the market in months, perhaps longer. He walked to town and found Opal's table, which was at the far end of the row, near the blacksmith's, and which displayed jars of honey in several shades, dark amber and light gold, and the nearly clear honey that comes from acacia. And behind the table stood the woman he had seen from the window, smaller than he had expected, with steady dark eyes and work-roughened hands. The woman in a brown dress with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, who was not beautiful in the way that beauty is typically understood, but who was beautiful in the way that competence is beautiful, and purpose is beautiful, and the steady attention of a person who cares about what she does is beautiful. "You are Opal Sayers," he said. I am Garrett Hollis. You have been leaving honey on my porch." "I have." "Why?" Opal looked at him. She looked at him with the directness that was her nature, and that was also the nature of bees, who do not dissemble, or qualify, or soften. "Because you needed it," she said. "And because I had it. And because giving what you have to someone who needs it is the only thing I know how to do that makes any sense." Garrett stood at the market table and looked at Opal Sayers, and felt the crack in the wall widen by a considerable margin. He bought a jar of the light gold honey and a jar of the acacia. He did not need it. He still had half of the last jar she had left. But the buying was a reason to stand at her table, and standing at her table was a thing he wanted to do, and the wanting was new and fragile, and he handled it carefully, the way a person handles something that might break. He came back the following Saturday, and the Saturday after that, and the one after that, until the coming was no longer an event but a pattern, and the pattern was no longer a habit but a need, and the need was no longer something he resisted, but something he walked toward with the closest thing to eagerness he had felt since Ada died. The purchases became conversations. The conversations became walks. She showed him the hives, the 30 white boxes in the clover field above Miller Creek, and the bees that moved around them in their purposeful thousands. And she explained the work of bees the way a teacher explains a subject she loves, with patience and careful detail, and the particular quiet joy that comes from sharing knowledge with someone who is genuinely interested. And Garrett was genuinely interested, not only in the bees but in the woman who kept them, and who had recognized his need from a distance, and who had answered it with honey, because honey was what she had, and giving was what she knew. He had not thought he was capable of interest. He had thought the capacity for interest had died with Ada. He was wrong, and the wrongness was the best thing that had happened to him in 2 years. She continued leaving jars on Sunday. He continued leaving the door open on Monday. The ritual persisted even after they knew each other, even after the anonymity was gone, because the ritual had become the language of whatever was growing between them. A language older and simpler than words, because the jar and the open door said everything that needed to be said. "I am here. I see you. I will keep coming." They married in October, in the clover field above Miller Creek, with the hives humming behind them, and the autumn light gold on the hills, and the old minister from the church in Jessamine performing the ceremony under the open sky, while bees from the nearest hive orbited the proceedings with the calm, unhurried industry of creatures who have work to do, and who do it regardless of what the humans are doing. Garrett moved the 30 hives to his farm, carrying each one carefully in the wagon, with Opal beside him instructing him on the angle and the steadiness required, so the bees would not be disturbed. And he built a honey house beside the tobacco barn with his own hands, framing it from oak and roofing it with cedar shingles, and the farm, which had been declining for 2 years, began to recover. Not because of the honey income, but because the farmer had recovered, and a farm is only as healthy as the person who tends it. And the person who tends this farm was healthy again, not because the grief was gone, but because the grief was no longer alone, and loneliness, not grief, had been the thing that was killing him. Opal left a jar of honey on the porch step every Sunday for the rest of their lives. She left it even though she lived there now, and could have simply put it in the kitchen. She left it because the jar on the step was how it had started, how she had reached a man who could not be reached by words or visits, or the well-meaning advice of neighbors who did not understand that grief is not a problem to be solved, but a country to be crossed. And you cannot cross it for someone else, but you can leave provisions along the road. And honey is the oldest and the sweetest provision there is. It was how it had started and how it would continue, and because some rituals are not about efficiency, but about remembering the crack in the wall and the light that came through it, and the woman who put it there, one jar at a time.